Okay, so I said I'd make a follow-up to the previous video on this breaking news from Paris. Um, the details have got a lot more dramatic insofar as the death toll is now thought to be well over 120. Some reports are saying as many as 160. Um, if those reports are accurate, and I don't see why they wouldn't be, that makes this the deadliest attack in Europe since Madrid, and it may surpass that. I think it's very important we keep a level head with this. Um, whenever major terrorist attacks occur, sometimes people will caveat that with saying, well, look at how many people die in road accidents and how many people die from smoking and so on. And it's true that vastly dwarfs the numbers killed in terrorism. But the thing about terrorism is it's man made, it is indiscriminate, and it can happen anywhere. New York City and London are on high alert tonight. I imagine most major cities in the world will be. I imagine Moscow will be as well. Um, it is important we keep level-headed and look at the situation objectively, but at the same time, I think you wouldn't be human if you weren't moved in some way by what is happening. This is a major, major terror attack. France is under a state of emergency. It's in full lockdown in a way that hasn't been since the Algerian War of the 1960s. Um, this is a major, major event. Um, and I think it is another demonstration that in the West we really, really, really need to wake up to the threat from radical Islam. And I make no apologies for saying that. I think at this stage, there's no doubt this was an Islamist attack. All the evidence seems to indicate that. If it is proved otherwise, I will come on, I will show my face, and I will say I was wrong, and I will take that back. But the attackers said this is for Syria. Whether this is connected to the death today of Jihadi John remains to be seen. Personally, I think that's a possibility, but I think this would have been a orchestrated attack. So it seems unlikely they would have just acted spontaneously, like, oh, they've killed Jihadi John, let's act now. That seems unlikely to me, but I might be wrong. Um, what frustrates me is we're going to see the same political correctness over this. Now, to be clear about that, I do understand the need for unity and I do understand the need for leaders to be responsible in the words. I get that. And of course, it is important that ordinary Muslims don't feel that they are being blamed for what these terrorist fanatics are doing. But, and this is something that really I have very strong views on, to simply say it is just terrorism is utterly misleading. This is ideological terrorism. Of course, most terrorism is, but this is ideologically based. This is Islamism. So to say that that has no connection with Islam is just utterly absurd. Um, the motivation for saying that is based on good intentions. It's based on community cohesion and so on. But I staunchly believe that in order to confront this problem, we need to address the ideology. The ideology is radical Islam. Let's stop beating around the bush. Let's stop being politically correct. Let's stop being so bloody spineless in the West and just call this problem for what it is. And it is up to leaders like Cameron, Obama, Hollande, Putin to call this problem what it is. As for the situation in Syria, and as for saying things like, oh, well, this is what you get for intervening, um, there is no moral compass whatsoever for what Islamic State is doing because they are not defending women and children who have died in Syria. They, this is a death cult that doesn't give a damn about the sanctity of life, whether it be French lives or British lives or Syrian lives. This death cult has murdered scores of people in Syria. And whatever their motivation for what they are doing, there is no moral caveat to what they are doing. They are not freedom fighters. And that is something that we need to really, really stress. And it frankly makes me furious that there are some on the left that will actually that they'll say things like, "Oh, we condemn the attacks," but this is what happens when, and they go on to make an explanation for it. Now that isn't the same as an excuse, but in my opinion, it is as good as trying to provide a moral argument for these terrorist fanatics, is they try to make a moral equivalency and they try to say that there's some sort of moral rationale behind what these people are doing. There is no moral rationale behind what they're doing. There isn't. Because if you think that they are people who are defending Syrian women and children from foreign invasion, that is a perverse view of what is happening. They have been killing and capturing and torturing and enslaving Syrian civilians for the past 2 years, and Iraqi civilians for that matter. Now, I've spoken out about what I think of the Assad regime, and I don't unsay a single word of that. The Assad regime has got rivers of blood on its hands, and we should never forget that. But the Assad regime doesn't threaten the rest of the world. This death cult does, and I am more adamant than ever that we need to seriously review our relations with Saudi Arabia, because that is where this ideology begins. And Western countries need to wake up as to what this regime has inspired. The fact of the matter is, Salafism, Wahhabism, begins in Saudi Arabia, and that's where the likes of Daesh are inspired. You know, they are trying to cement a civil war between Shia and Sunni, and it comes down to this death cult that is radical Islam, and it can be seen from the Philippines to North Africa and beyond. Um, my message to any Muslims watching this is, of course, you're not responsible for what's happened. Of course, these people are terrorists, but it is time that we need to just accept the facts, and the facts are this is ideologically based. Islamism is part of Islam. There's no escaping that fact, and I think it is very important that there are approaches brought about within the Muslim community. I don't want to say the Muslim community because British Muslims are British citizens, but this is where these jihadist filth are coming from. There's no escaping that fact. They're being radicalized on the streets of Britain, the streets of Denmark, the streets of Germany. This is what's happening. And this attack we've seen tonight is not going to be the last one. I don't think that's scaremongering. I think it's reality. Um, of course, it's true that more people die in car crashes and so on. But I do think that we need to accept there is a real problem here. And this is going to go on for years. And I don't believe that simply having no intervention in the Middle East is going to stop the problem. I definitely think the foreign policy is a major, major factor, no question about it. But the idea that, oh, if we have no intervention in the Middle East, this won't happen. Look at Nigeria. There's no Nigerian troops in Syria. There's no Nigerian airstrikes in Syria. Nigeria, for the past 5 years, has had 20,000 dead from Boko Haram. Boko Haram has just aligned itself with Daesh. They're calling themselves, they've renamed themselves, I believe, Islamic State in West Africa or something along those lines. My point would be that this Islamist ideology is a worldwide virus. And I'm not scaremongering by using that sort of language. That's how I feel about it. That is the reality. That is what we are facing. Of course, it is important that there is community cohesion. Of course, it is important that Muslims don't feel that they're collectively blamed. But it is equally important that Muslims recognize that this is a problem within Islam. And if that is politically incorrect, if that offends anybody, I'm sorry. But the world turns upside down when we cannot call a spade a spade. So there isn't much more to add to this, but I do think that we're going to really, really, really need to, for a start, use language that is both responsible but also honest. That means not just talking about terrorism, because terrorism covers a very broad field. You can have far right terrorism, you can have animal rights terrorism. For example, when certain extreme animal rights groups use nail bombs and so terrorism itself covers a very wide field. This is Islamist terrorism, and in my opinion, leaders should be calling it what it is. There's no point just saying they're terrorists. I understand the logic is to isolate them, but it isn't working because these people are radicalizing young Muslims every day. And to anyone who wants to dismiss this video as Islamophobic, I would point out that the vast majority of their victims are Muslims. So that's just a few thoughts to leave you with. I am quite moved by what has happened in Paris. I am quite angry about it, but not in the sense of being like, let's collectively blame all Muslims or anything like that. But I've got very little time for organizations that are going to use this once again to say, oh, well, look at what the West has done. Now, that's whatever you think of Western foreign policy, for goodness sake, put the blame on terrorism on those who do it. The people responsible for this are those who have pulled the trigger, are those who have taken the hostages. To disassociate them with their own actions is perverse. And if any of these fuckers survive, they need the full force of French law thrown at them. Actually, I don't believe in the death penalty. Why? Because all it would do is martyrize them. In my opinion, they should be locked up for the rest of their miserable lives. I don't believe in the death penalty for terrorists because if you do that, number one, it's what they want. Number two, it's an easy way out. And number three, all it does is martyrize them in a way that incarceration doesn't. But the West needs to wake up. This is not the first attack in recent years. There was the attacks in Australia, in Canada, the attack in January in France. We've had thwarted attacks here. There's been thwarted attacks in the States. And I wouldn't even say that this is only a Western problem. This is a worldwide problem. The Philippines has suffered from it. Indonesia suffered from it. Nigeria suffered from it. Granted, the specific circumstances aren't exactly the same, but there is a consistency, and that is this Islamist virus. I'm not talking about Islam as a whole, and I'm sure as hell not talking about all Muslims. So please, please, please don't think that is my message. It's not. In fact, Muslims should be just as angry and concerned about this cancer as anyone, because they're equally going to be targeted. If you're Sunni or Shia, they're going to try and drive sectarianism among you. I think the vast majority of Muslims will be level-headed about this and not buy into their crap. But the problem is there are susceptible young people who will. I think regarding the Middle East and regarding the situation there, I've made a lot of comments on what's been going on. There's been a lot of fingers pointed. I think it's come to the point where the powers need to work together. It's the only way the war in Syria is going to end. The time has come to stop pointing fingers, and that applies to both sides. Stop pointing fingers. We need to work with Russia now. I'm going to say that. And I stand by everything I've said before. I still think both the West and Russia is responsible for the war in Syria. The West for backing Saudi Arabia and Russia for backing the Assad regime. Both sides have blood in their hands. Therefore, it is up to both sides now to work together find a peace plan. Um, as for Islamic State, of course they need to be marginalized, but how we do that, it's very, very difficult because the Syrian opposition will not accept any peace proposals that have a timetable for Assad to potentially run as president again. So these matters are extremely complex, but I do believe there needs to be cooperation between Moscow and the West, and it's up to both sides. So I don't believe it's just up to the West to stop accusing Moscow of things. Moscow should also stop their propaganda and stop constantly saying, the West backed ISIS. The truth is, the West backed Saudi Arabia, which is the inspiration for ISIS. That's not exactly the same thing. But the point is, countries need to work together here. That's the bottom line. And, I heard one guy today on the BBC say that it would be better for Jihadi John to have been arrested and to be put before trial. I've mixed opinions on that. It's true that assassinating him is not, isn't going to stop ISIS, and there'll be plenty more Jihadi Johns. That's true. Ideally, he would be arrested, but here's the question: how do people propose that happens? If they're opposed to a ground invasion, then how do they propose that Jihadi John is detained? What other way is there to do it? I mean, the only way would be to have commandos on the ground to arrest him, or for the Syrian regime to arrest him. But then there would be double standards there because the Syrian regime itself is responsible for scores of civilian deaths. So this situation is painfully complicated. I mean, and let's say you did bring him to trial. What's to say he won't use that as basically a platform for Islamist propaganda? To use it as a platform to recruit more people. And there's a very real chance of that happening. So I don't think there's any simple answers here. The relatives of those who were executed by this guy, they said they had mixed feelings. They said they were relieved that he's dead, but also disappointed that he won't face justice. I can understand that because it could be seen that he's had an easy way out. But anyway, what's happening in Paris really should be an eye opener to what is already obvious. And I do think that we are our own worst enemy sometimes when we basically go out of our way to be sensitive and to not just call a spade a spade. West needs to accept that radical Islam is a thing, it is a reality. But in terms of the source, I believe our greatest foreign policy error is our ties to Saudi Arabia. And that is something that really, really needs to be reviewed. Cameron said Saudis have protected us. But this death cult originates in Saudi Arabia. He said, Saudi intelligence has protected British citizens. It isn't just that Islamism originates in Saudi Arabia, it's also their barbaric human rights record, which just presents us as hypocrites when we lecture other countries about human rights. I mean, there's a lot of things to consider here. Another practical issue is security in France, how this attack managed to go ahead. It's different from the London bombings insofar as it wasn't bombs on the subway. Um, there's going to be questions about how the gunmen managed to get into the stadium and so on and so on. Well, there was bombing in the stadium, how they managed to get into this concert hall with the heavy metal things going underway. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Any pro-Islamist comments? I'm going to delete. I'm not going to allow my channel to be a platform for that. I'm going to allow different opinions, but any pro-Islamist comments?